Welcome, everyone. We're excited to share part of our Lakehouse journey with you today. So the part that we'll be talking about is really on the data strategy piece, how we articulated the value of updating our data platform to senior leadership at T-Mobile, to non-technical senior leadership at T-Mobile to get their buy-in. So we're going to run through a little bit of an intro, who we are, where we sit within T-Mobile, and how we support our business unit, and then how we articulated our data strategy by mapping it to the business unit's pain points, how we then converted that strategy into architecture, took that architecture and managed concerns and expectations as we were migrating, and the lessons that we learned along the way. We really believe that it's important for technology to be accessible. So what we're going to review here is really just a simple way of articulating a data strategy and mapping that to the Lakehouse architecture to your leadership. All right, so who we are. Within T-Mobile, data is really decentrally managed. So there are lots of teams like ours that exist within business units. We're not part of central IT. We're not part of the digital team. We actually fall within finance in a group called procurement and supply chain. So we support a very back office heavy business unit. And we work within a data solutions and analytics team that centrally manages data for that business unit. And my name is Ellen Schultz, and I lead that team. I'm the director of that group.
And I am the I'm the lead architect, along with Robert Thompson, who's also in the
So the procurement and supply chain function at T-Mobile is really quite critical because it is not only buying everything for the enterprise, but also our network equipment. So as you can imagine, when we were going into our 5G site build, procuring and shipping, moving our network equipment is very critical to achieving our 5G targets. We really actually like where we sit. So it's kind of nice to be removed from the process and overhead of central IT. We have a lot of agility and a lot of freedom with what we do. As you can imagine, the downside is that you're in a non-technical team that doesn't really understand the technical concepts you're trying to articulate. So it's really important for us to keep things as accessible as possible. All right, so to start, we're going to go really basic. What were the pain points that we were experiencing within the procurement and supply chain group? So just to set also a little bit of context, prior to the Lakehouse, we were using Azure Data Warehouse. So a lot of the feedback that you see here is reflective of what we experienced using an Azure Data Warehouse. And we felt that the best approach to resonate with our business unit was to really derive our strategy from the feedback we were directly getting from them. So we heard a lot of things around, they're a supply chain team, they're doing ops, they needed to make operational decisions, they needed really low latency, like as close to real-time data as possible to be able to make those decisions. They really wanted what they saw in like their warehouse management system to reflect what they saw in their reporting. We heard a lot around, that the analytics teams within those business units, their queries were failing. There were performance issues. Their Power BI dashboards wouldn't refresh, that kind of thing. We also heard quite a bit about the spend. So we're on Azure. Our cloud spend was pretty wild. And we were just kind of growing with more and more users who were getting value out of our data, and we were having a really hard time supporting our growth. So we took all of that very specific direct feedback and we aggregated it into really what are the 4 pillars of the data strategy that we went with. So when we were talking about operational decision making and the data is different than what we see in the system, we call that data latency. So data latency is one of the pillars of our strategy. When we're talking about wanting to be able to share data across the enterprise or share data back to a vendor, or we're onboarding a new vendor and we want to pull that system's data in. We called that data mobility, just sharing data back and forth. When we talk about my queries are failing or my reports aren't refreshing, performance, it's just predictable performance. And then obviously our spend, we refer to that as economies of scale. So we thought about, not only, yes, our leadership cares about our spend and our OpEx, we also internally represented kind of the ability to infinitely grow, just to bring on more users, more data. That also represented economies of scale for us. So we tried to keep it really simple and really accessible for our leadership. And just these are the 4 pillars of our strategy derived directly from the feedback that we heard from you.
So the problem that we had with this architecture is pretty simple. If we're technical in the audience, we're all going to point out that we have a bottleneck at our Azure data warehouse. It's a single appliance that if we wanted to grow or allow more people to use it, we have to scale up instead of out, which as we all know is exponential instead of linear. So it also has a problem with mobility because it is a silo. If people want to join data with other places, then they have to either get it into that silo or out of that silo. All of the different people running all of the different workloads cause lots of contention, both in access to compute resources, but also to object blocking. So OLAP reports that we're running would block our ETL, would cause unpredictable performance, and then would cause latency because of that. So it was very easy for us to identify, here's the problem that we are trying to address.
So those 4 pillars of our strategy, well, we actually started with our data strategy by setting a bit of a vision. We were really familiar with the other data teams at T-Mobile. We kind of saw what they were doing. Everyone was experiencing similar problems to us. So when we tackled this, we wanted a platform that we could roll out potentially to the enterprise and influence all the other data teams at T-Mobile to convert to whatever we chose. So our vision was really something that could scale to the enterprise. We then specifically defined each of those pillars that we set out. So we said with low latency data, we wanted to be able to provide the most up-to-date raw and transformed data to our users, yes, like the analysts, but also to the systems. We were providing operational data to other applications, and we wanted it to be as real-time as possible. So to measure that, we're looking at our refresh cadence. So we created metrics that we felt measured each of the pillars of our strategy. And then we said, we'll see improvements in this, and this is how we're going to talk to our leadership about it. So you agree that these are the pillars, they're derived from your feedback. Here are the metrics to how we'll know that we're successful when we go forward with this. So for latency, refresh cadence, ETL processing time, we had a couple really, really complicated ETL processes that would take 4+ hours to complete. Sometimes they wouldn't. So we used those as sort of benchmarks with our data latency. Then for high data mobility, we really wanted that to measure our ability to share data in and out and consume data where it resides. We don't want to have to make another copy of our data and put it somewhere else. So to measure our mobility, we looked at the number of connections that we were making, the number of systems that we were ingesting, the number of applications and systems that we were then sharing our data with, and the time that it took us to onboard data. So how quickly we could get a new system's data available for our users. For predictable performance, the name of the game was consistent query performance. So we wanted it to be predictable. We wanted it to be consistent. Not necessarily the fastest, but you knew what to expect. And so for that, we measured data availability. I think that's like pretty basic. And then the query failure rate, because we had a lot of contention. We had a lot of folks with failing queries. And for economies of scale, this is where we were looking to take more enterprise approach and be able to establish cost containment and cost efficiencies that would reflect that scale. So we looked at infrastructure spend, so this is just straight up our Azure budget, and resource efficiency. So we have a limited number of staff. It's hard to get more headcount, and so how can we really efficiently manage the data we have with the staff that we have? All right, so we're not going to keep you in suspense. We'll tell you how it was successful right off the bat. So for latency, for our refresh cadence, we saw about a 75% reduction in our refresh cadence. Today, our data refreshes around every hour and a half. And our ETL processing times, those really, really complex queries that we had to run, those are down from 4 hours to around 30 minutes. So we are providing much more near real-time data as we can. And really, a lot of times the limitation here is the system that we're getting data from. For our data mobility, we saw about a 30% increase in the connections that we were establishing. It's really easy for us to share our data, and it's really easy for us to ingest more data. So right now, we're at around 55 connection points. We are ingesting data from around 41 systems across T-Mobile, and we are providing data to around 14 systems across T-Mobile in an operational capacity, whether it's like our warehouse management system or Salesforce applications, that kind of thing.
It's worth pointing out that those 14 are actually places that we are explicitly shipping data to, like Salesforce. We have far, far more than that are using our compute resources in order to query without moving data around now.
Yeah. And for predictable performance, for data availability, when we were with our Azure Data Warehouse, we were around 98% available, and now we're a little over 99%. And that probably doesn't seem like much, and maybe measuring availability like that isn't the most, accurate way of measuring our performance. The real big win here is that our user support Slack channel is like so quiet. We were getting reached out to by our analysts all the time. Is this data up to date? It hasn't been refreshed. It doesn't match what I see, and now it's much easier to manage. For query failures, we've seen a reduction rate of around 60%. So we've reduced our query failure rate from around 1.5% to 0.6%. Economies of scale, our infrastructure, this is where we had our biggest success that was easiest, obviously, to sell to leadership. So our Azure spend prior to our Lakehouse was in the ballpark, and remember, we're just one team at T-Mobile. This is not reflective of T-Mobile's entire cloud budget. But we're spending around $440K a month in our Azure cloud, and we were able to, when we migrated to the Lakehouse, reduce that by $120K a month, which is really significant, especially for a team that's back office, sitting within a business unit. In resource efficiency, we haven't increased our staff. We have the same number of data engineers, and we've added 10 new systems worth of data with that same group, and we've been able to operationally support it.
So when we were looking for how we were going to solve what our future state architecture was going to be, it was obvious to us that the fundamental principle of separation of compute and storage that lies at the heart of Lakehouse would solve all of these problems at once. So because we have workload isolation, everybody has their own compute. We don't have noisy neighbors. We're not moving data around, so we get faster data. So we reduce our latency that way. Because we're querying data where it resides, and we don't need to ship it somewhere else for people to consume it, they're using whatever compute they want, solves the data mobility problem. It has to get into the Lakehouse, yes, but once it's there, it's solved. Predictable perf, again, because everybody has their own compute, there's no noisy neighbors, and they're able to reliably know that their report is going to finish in about the same time every time it runs. And then for scaling, it scales out instead of up. So you just add more commodity hardware, it becomes a linear problem instead of exponential. It explains itself. So this is the architecture that we settled on. The most obvious is that we extracted all of the ETL into the Lakehouse. And we provide the serverless compute to our customers so that they seamlessly were able to transition their reports. We're using Synapse Analytics because there's a lot of people who use like Excel or Power BI. But they're welcome to bring whatever compute they want. So we have some teams that are reading from us using Databricks directly. Most of all of those problems just come straight down to where we're talking about the Databricks. We extracted the ETL there. There were some other things that we did that improved us a lot. Like part of the migration was we made modular ADF flows, but that's a whole nother talk about how data engineering is part of software engineering, and we don't have time, so.
All right, so as you can imagine, we got a lot of feedback on our plan. There were a lot of concerns, and I think the concerns that we experienced are pretty standard SLT kind of concerns. So it's time, money, impact, and in our case, also security. So folks wanted to know, how much time is it going to take to migrate from ADW to a Lakehouse? In reality, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter how long it takes us to migrate, because every workload that we migrate is going to improve our performance. It's going to reduce our cost. So we're going to see incremental benefit along the way. But we told them a year. We told them it would take us a year to convert around the 30 systems worth of data that we had already ingested into ADW and port that over. For the cost, we really didn't ask for additional resources or budget to be able to support our migration. Probably because we initially already had everything in ADLS, so it was really just migrating our ETL. But we rolled this into just our normal capacity to manage tech debt. So we just used the expected 30% capacity of our data engineers to add this to their backlog and slowly iterate through our migration. We did expect an initial increase in infrastructure costs, just because for that first migration, we're going to have ETL happening in multiple places, so there's compute in multiple places, but we actually didn't see that spike. It was so cheap. So for money, that was how we addressed the concern. We don't need additional resources. There might be a small infrastructure spike, but that's going to be quickly mitigated. For the user impacts, as Jeff mentioned, we provide the serverless SQL endpoints to our end users. So we were able to quell the concerns of the business. Your team is basically just going to have to change an endpoint. That's all that's going to happen. They're still going to be able to use SSMS, Alteryx, Power BI, like the standard tools that they were using at that time. We also, there was this understanding or assumption that there were concerns on security. Well, if I put all my data in the data lake, everyone's going to have access to it. And I don't know where this mindset came from, but we were really effectively able to mitigate that with the use of AAD groups, having those consistent through all fabrics where the data was being made available. And really the barriers to access became process-driven and not driven by the technology. So that was the feedback that we heard from our leadership when we shared our plans for the Lakehouse, and this is how we addressed it. And then we migrated, and it's honestly kind of a boring migration. I mean, it's just converting workload after workload, pretty standard project management. We reported our metrics out along the way. So we tracked our availability and our costs. We saw improved availability. We saw reduced costs every time that we would convert a sizable workload. And we also saw with those workloads that we converted, this data is now being made available closer to real time. We're having fewer pipeline failures. So it was more available to our consumers. We did go big on our first workload that we prioritized. So when we were doing all of our Azure Data Warehouse work, that was peak planning for T-Mobile 5G build, it still is an enormous investment. At that point in time, we had created an allocation algorithm to optimally distribute the material that we had in our warehouse to the right bills of materials and then sites for construction. So we had this really intense optimization algorithm that started as a bit of a reporting problem, how could I do this optimally, but quickly became, this is so great, I want you to give this to my warehouse management group, I want them managing their logistics aligned to this recommendation. So it became operational overnight, but we couldn't support that. And we knew, at that point, T-Mobile was spending around $60 million in inventory every week. They were allocating around $60 million of inventory every week at that point. And anytime we missed an allocation on the week, it was around a $20 million hit to the books because you have to line up so much crew, field services. There's so much depending on you getting your material to an endpoint on time. And at that point, we were missing allocation probably around every 6 weeks, just given the instability of our data warehouse. So it was a pretty easy sell that this was the first thing that we were going to migrate. And once we migrated it, it was really no problem. And that was a really big win that helped them get behind more the movement of getting everything over there. All right, so where are we right now? Last year was all about migrating to the Lakehouse. We sold that as like, it's chaotic, we're reliably containing the chaos in the Lakehouse. We treated it mostly as a lift and shift. Everything got moved pretty much as is. And now, this year, our goal is all about simplifying what exists in the Lakehouse. So, we migrated all that noise. We didn't spend too much time refactoring it before we pulled it over. And in this year, we're introducing a bit more of a focus on data modeling, deriving these base entities from all of this data that we have that represent key constructs to our business, like a worker or a SKU or an order, and then building these curated sets that are kind of more like our sanctioned data sets so that you can get all of your expenses or information on leasing or that kind of thing. So introducing that data model is one of the things that we're doing to manage the chaos that we migrated into our Lakehouse. And then we're also focusing on unifying our compute experience. So TMIS and UDA on this slide, those are our Azure data warehouses. TMIS was the big one that we pointed our users to, but we quickly had to create a backup because we couldn't support all of the workload that we had, so we had this kind of like replication. And our goal is to really get everything into the Lakehouse and get all of our users there. So they're still lingering in the ADW world. And to do that, we're rolling out, we've implemented Unity Catalog so that we have increased observability, which improves our team's security posture. It improves the user experience from a lineage perspective. And we are working with Databricks serverless endpoint instead of today we use Synapse to try to improve performance and continue to provide, you can use your same tools. You can use Alteryx, you can use Power BI, but the performance is a little bit better.
A lot better.
So that's what we're doing this year to sort of simplify. All right. So we already told you about our success early on. The Lakehouse has really exceeded our expectations. It's let us do a lot more with less. Less budget, less headcount. We have more data. We have predictable performance. Our users are much happier. So it's been a huge win, and this is how we quantified our success. We said these are the metrics that we're going for with our SLT, and we reported them every step along the way, and here we are, and this was the outcome from it. We did learn a few things. So I mentioned that we primarily support back office. It's a lot of like ERP, warehouse management systems, order management systems, and I think the industry there must just be behind in terms of the capabilities of those systems to provide real-time data. We have encountered that the limiting factor in our ability to provide real-time data is really the systems that we're pulling the data from, not our Lakehouse. So that was a bit of an interesting discovery. We kind of thought change data capture was the norm, and this was going to be a little quicker for us. One of the key things that I learned is that you still need a data model. So I think I'd always associated a data model with like, oh, my query will run more optimally, but the governance component that it kind of brings to the table is also critical. So that's why we're focusing a lot this year on building out these sanctioned data sets so that we can direct our users to the most reliable data that we're confident in. But I don't think I expected it to be as critical as it's ended up being. And then old habits die hard. So a lot of our users, they're still hesitant to switch. And we have tried to really like bottoms up. We do our office hours. We have our Slack support channels, give them all of the carrots to convert. And in 2024, so once we complete kind of our simplification that we're doing this year, next year is like, nah, you're migrating, and we're gonna kind of force it and take a bit more of a tops-down approach. And also, we created this platform where you can really bring a more global lens to your data instead of just focusing on how you want it interpreted within your team. But the teams don't think that way. They're just so focused on delivering for their business and what their VP needs. They're not thinking about, well, how do I make my leasing data available to the network engineering team that might care about our leasing terms? And they're not just bringing that global perspective to their data. So they are still developing in silos in a way.
That being said, that there is a lot of old habits that are hard to kill. The success that our Lakehouse architecture brought to our business domain, and a couple of other teams at T-Mobile have been using as well, got the attention of senior leadership. And so now the enterprise as a whole, so Ellen talked about what we're focusing on for our internal stuff, but the enterprise as a whole, we've been helping them move to this new architecture of shared lakehouses, where each data business unit controls its own data, saves it as delta tables, but then registers it with a shared set of corporate governance tools. And that sounds very simple. Yeah, we have shared governance tools. Everybody in this room knows that that's a continual work in progress. But the fact that in order for you to get rid of those 4 problems that we were talking about before, the predictable performance, the data latency, data mobility, economies of scale, all you have to do is save your data out to delta tables and then share it. Really was a powerful story that spoke for itself once we had said, hey, this is what it's gonna do, watch it in action, and now the rest of T-Mobile is saying, hey, we should all do that too. So we've been helping them with their templated ADF in order to make it easy for them to get their data out into delta tables, helping them with what the governance tool should be and how we're going to feed data into it. And that's going to be a work in progress for a while at T-Mobile.
Yeah. All right, that's the bulk of our content. We have published a few white papers. Jeff and Robert have done Ask Me Anythings with Denny Lee a couple of times, and those are on YouTube. So if you want to learn more about our architecture, our story, some of the case studies that we've done, we have a Medium page. We put our stuff there. There's links here. I know that the content will be shared, but we're happy to take any questions that you all may have.